Good evening, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to yet another edition of Truth to Power. My name is Faraz Patel. I will be in your company for the next 50 minutes or so on this episode that we have right here on ITV Networks. Now, from the years of 2007 until 2014, a unit was developed within the South African Revenue Service. The unit initially in the book, the SARS Road Unit Discussion, the inside story into it, which was published in 2016 by the man I'm about to interview now, the author of the book, Johan van Lochrenberg. It spoke about this unit going deep into taking on the illicit economy, organized crime, and those criminal syndicates who were escaping their taxes. Now, to the opposing side of it, it was known as the Rogue Unit, which many South Africans know of it now. Now, when I do mention the word Rogue Unit, do remember that it will be in inverted commas because it has still not been classified as an official rogue unit for it to be taken off the exclamation marks. We are going to be dealing with topics like, for example, names like Project Snowman, Project Broken Arrow, and of course the IGI report by the then late Faith Radebe. And of course we're going to be discussing the Public Protector's report and of course the report from the Sikakane one. So joining me on Truth to Power, I have the former SARS executive and of course a gentleman of 3 books. One of them, of course, published this year called Cop Undercover. It is Mr. Johan van Lochrenberg. Johan, good evening and thank you so much for joining us on Truth to Power.
Salam alaikum, Mr. Patel and all your viewers.
Wa alaikum salam. Johan, you can call me Faraz, it's okay. Johan, just before we go into the discussion, next month, Mr. Tom Moyane and Mr. Praveen Gordhan. Mr. Tom Moyane, of course, is going to cross-examine Mr. Praveen Gordhan. I know there's going to be a number of issues that will be, of course, cross-examined during the State Capture Commission of Inquiry, but one of them, of course, is with regards to the discussion of the rogue unit. I just want you to get your comment with regards to that.
Well, I don't know. I know that Mr. Gordhan has testified before the Zondo Commission, and Mr. Moyane has applied for leave to cross-examine him on the testimony that he provided before the Zondo Commission, which I think is a good thing. And that means Mr. Moyane must himself go under oath, and we will then, hear his side of things. So I think it's a fair process to be heard, something that I've always been denied by Mr. Moyane. So no, it must be, it must be what must be. I'm not too sure how the process works at the Zondo Commission, though. My understanding is that it's limited to, if you implicate somebody in a particular thing, then you're limited to that, aspect of your testimony. But I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But I think it's a good thing.
Okay, Johan, let's go to obviously the topic of the discussion. So it's 2007, the then SARS Commissioner, Mr. Praveen Gordhan. There's a unit that does get established, right? So my understanding, and please do correct me, because I think the purpose of this episode is to give education not only to myself, but to all the viewers. This unit established at SARS, what was its main purpose? And why then, after so many years, was it then labeled as the rogue unit?
Okay. Look, it's quite a layered story, but I'll try and simplify it. Because it's been explained so many times before, so many different courts and, different fora under oath endlessly. And it seems, for those who it suits to call the unit rogue, none of these facts matter. Simply put, in the years 2005 to 2007, there were discussions and efforts between the then National Intelligence Agency, that is now known as the State Security Agency, and the South African Revenue Service, sought to find a way to bolster the government's ability to address organized revenue and customs and excise criminality. These are high-risk investigations of organized crime syndicates. And at the time, the Revenue Service had great difficulty with respect to, some of our investigators getting shot at, assaulted, kidnapped, falsely arrested, and even killed. And so in the course of those years, there were these different models that had been floated between the two agencies, and by the way, also with the police and the Hawks. And in this particular instance, the idea was to create a capability within the National Intelligence Agency, which would have been funded at the startup by, to some extent, at least for personnel cost, by the South African Revenue Service, which would then operate as a unit within the National Intelligence Agency and would penetrate and infiltrate organized crime syndicates in the way that intelligence agencies do these sorts of things. And that, by that I mean things like intercepting telephone calls legitimately, using agents to infiltrate and pretend like they are, criminals when they're not, and that sort of methodology, front companies and so forth. However, in early 2007, whereas there was agreement at operational level on all sides, and even at ministerial level, to the extent that the application for such funding for a period of 3 years was approved, the idea came to naught. And so the original concept of such a unit to be housed within the National Intelligence Agency never happened. The concept that was approved was never implemented, and the monies that were asked for was never allocated. In other words, that idea, that memo that's floating around never happened. Instead, what happened was the National Intelligence Agency pretty much went cold on the Revenue Service, because at the time they were going through their own, shall I say, growing pains. There was a lot of internal structuring, there was a lot of leadership changes going on and so on, and they did not consider the Revenue Service as a priority. And so as a consequence, the Revenue Service sought a number of legal opinions from very esteemed counsel to see what alternative means could they develop that could assist the Revenue Service in combating organized crime, specifically in relation to tax evasion, customs, and excise fraud, which was pandemic. It was a big problem. The country was just bleeding a lot of money in these syndicates. And it was then out of that set of legal opinions that a completely different type of unit was developed. In fact, a number of units were formed at the same time, of which this unit was the smallest. And it's strange to me that, here we sit in 2020 and nobody reflects on any of the other units that were formed at the same time. It's only this one that seems to be a problem. But in short, the idea of conducting, intelligence-type operations by way of telephone intercepts or using agents and front companies and that sort of thing was completely taken off the table. And a small little unit comprising of just over 20 people was set up. About half of them were based in offices, Revenue Service offices in Megawatt Park, and the other half was based in Tshwane, in Pretoria, in Hatfield. And they also had a presence in head office. In fact, two of the people sat right next to me at the head office, Lehigh Lasars. But in time, we found that they were predominantly field-based, and we borrowed a model from the German tax authority. Their auditors effectively work in the same way in which most government departments work during lockdown, which is remotely. And so because these people were in the field, they were provided with hot desks, which they could use from time to time if they needed to access central systems. And they conducted none of those, type of investigations that have been attributed to them over the years. They didn't have all that fancy equipment or anything like that. What they basically did was primarily what we call desktop analysis. So they used access to different third-party data systems to build profiles of subjects that were under audit or investigation. And they facilitated and assisted other law enforcement agencies and investigative units within the South African Revenue Service. And they focused on the dangerous kind of work where our normal auditors' lives were at risk, or the work or evidence we considered at risk. And here I mean people like, cigarette smugglers, people who broke into state warehouses, theft, abalone smugglers, and that sort of thing. And they would either identify witnesses or people who could provide evidence or information on these criminals, or alternatively, they would identify the evidence or the scene of the crime, or alternatively, they would then conduct these profiles or a combination of those activities. And their products would then be provided either to the police, or they would work hand in hand with the police. And their work resulted in big cigarette busts or big abalone busts. They still hold the record for the biggest abalone bust in South African history. That was 6 tons in KwaZulu-Natal. And they still hold the record for the biggest illicit cigarette bust, which was 75,000 tons. That's massive.
Yeah. Johan, unfortunately, I'm going to have to cut you there. We have to go for a break. We will definitely continue this discussion after this short break. I'm in discussion with former SARS executive Johan van Lochrenberg. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Truth to Power. I'm in conversation with former SARS executive Johan van Lochrenberg. Johan, I apologize for that. We had to go to the break. You were continuing saying the massive numbers of course, the bus that, of course, the unit had conducted at the time. So please do continue with that.
Okay. I should say that I managed 5 units, actually, and not one. Although, I became the poster boy of this unit. This unit was the smallest unit of 5 units that I oversaw. And these units worked together. So they didn't work in silos. They supported each other and did different pieces of different projects, depending on what we were working on at any given point in time. Towards the end of 2008, in fact, on Christmas Day, whilst he was on holiday, one of the members of this particular unit, which at that point in time was known as the National Research Group, was bussed by the police in a major sting operation together with a host of other syndicate members for having poached rhino illegally. And he made a confession on the scene, and he was arrested, and he never let us know. And as a consequence, we started looking for him when everybody came back from holiday, and ultimately we found him in Hartswater in prison. He was put through a disciplinary trial. First, he went to the CCMA for arbitration. So it's, already the unit couldn't have been unknown if SARS went to the CCMA, on this. The unit was on record already at that point in time for anybody to inspect. But the long and the short of it, he ultimately threatened people, and he threatened to expose them, and he did. We got wind of this because he started approaching some of the South African Revenue Service people with a view to recruit them on some devious plan which he wanted to cause chaos and havoc at the Revenue Service. And according to this documented plan, He was just made Minister of Finance, Mr. Praveen Gordhan, the then Deputy Commissioner at the Revenue Service, and myself were the three primary targets of this project, which they called Project Broken Arrow.
Arrow, yes, yes.
And Project Broken Arrow's output, according to this gentleman, his name is Michael Pichal, was to produce a file or a dossier, which was then going to be taken to then President Zuma with a view to cause this havoc and chaos at the Revenue Service. Now, because he tried to recruit people within the Revenue Service, some of the honest people came to us and reported this, and we asked them to put it on record at the time, which they did in great detail. And so by the time he came forth with this dossier, which he named Snowman, we were approached by the media. The first time, as I recall, was in October or November 2009. And at that point in time, he effectively placed all of the people in harm's way by naming them. Now, the dossier itself is a complete concoction of nonsense. And what we did was we got a whole lot of people together, including some lawyers, and we did a line-by-line refutation together with annexes and documents, and we briefed the media. And we then briefed the police, we briefed the National Intelligence Agency, we briefed two parliamentary committees, we briefed the president himself, and a host of other people. The Snowman dossier gained traction again in early February 2010, when this Mr. Picha gave the same bogus dossier to Mr. Malema, who made some noise in the media about it. And as a consequence, I personally briefed Mr. Malema. We did an even more in-depth refutation of that nonsense. And we then went on record with the National Intelligence Agency and the police and various parliamentarians and other agencies. We requested them to come and investigate the matter. They interviewed our people. They asked for things like the budgets, the list of the cases, the outputs. They asked to interview people in the unit. And this occurred on 3 occasions in 2010. And the Revenue Service went a step further. We went to virtually every single media house in the country and briefed them in detail and left them with a thick stack of documents, which included, by the way, the mandate of the unit as it was approved and details of what the unit had done. And so in that sense, you know, at least that fake nonsense was dealt with as far as we were concerned. And every year, it would come up a little bit here and there, usually from people who either got fired or people who were unhappy with the Revenue Service for one reason or another. And, you know, we would just constantly haul out these line-by-line refutations and you know, annexes, and then you know, people would look at it and they would realize this is complete nonsense, and then they would move on. But of course, this changed in 2014 when effectively a number of errant taxpayers, a number of people who were in litigation with the Revenue Service, particularly from the tobacco industry, as well as some members of an illicit tobacco task team that was a multi-agency team consisting of Hawks and State Security Agency people, crime intelligence, and so forth. They came to realize that we were onto some of their shenanigans, and we immediately became the enemy. And as a consequence, they began to merge their bits and pieces of nonsense that they were cooking up, and they crossed paths with Mr. Picha. And when that happened, they combined their stories, and out of that was born the so-called rogue unit narrative. Now, this happened towards the end of 2014.
Yes.
And the first newspaper article entitled SARS Bugged Zuma, which introduced this unit as a rogue unit, was on 12 October 2014 in the Sunday Times.
With Mr. Piet Rampedi as the Mr. Peter Rampedi was the author of it, am I right?
Actually, there were four.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly, it was Mr. Rampedi, Mr. Wa Afrika,
Yes.
Mr. Malcolm Rees, and Mr. Hofstadter. And they then wrote this article, and that introduced this unit now as a rogue unit. And at the time, the claim was that this unit had supposedly broken into the home of Mr. Zuma in Forest Town and planted a listening device there and secretly listened to his conversations. The same article also suggested that they were involved in mysterious deaths and all sorts of bizarre claims. This was 2 weeks after President Zuma had announced the appointment of Mr. Tom Moyane as the Commissioner of the Revenue Service. And of course, what none of us knew at the time, which we now know, is that since 2013 already, President Zuma and Mr. Moyane, together with Bain and Company, and a couple of other people within the Revenue Service, such as Mr. Jonas Makwakwa, had been secretly meeting and plotting and planning how to take over the Revenue Service and change the model and make all sorts of adjustments to it. But that was effectively then the birth of the so-called the label rogue unit. And that then gave traction to the story. Of course, the difficulty we had at that point was that whereas in the past we were able to always haul out the line-by-line refutations of, the Snowman dossier, in the case of Mr. Moyane, he was simply not willing or able or in any mood to allow us to defend the institution and its officials in the public space. In fact, we were all banned from saying anything to the media, which in turn led the journalists to just, take any piece of paper with half a claim on it and report it as if fact. That was then soon followed with another salacious headline, Taxman's Rogue Unit Ran Brothel. And, over time, there were 36 articles and 4 editorials over a period of 2 calendar years. And in the meantime, within the Revenue Service, there were these so-called panels. The first one of which is known as the Sikakane panel. Then came the Kruan board, and then there was the KPMG process. And simultaneous to the Sikakane panel in 2014, which we now know was also the Inspector General of Intelligence process.
Mr. van Lochrenberg, we are going to come back after the break to obviously have a further discussion with regards to the SARS rogue unit and, of course, various other discussions that led up to, of course, the Sunday Times report and, of course, immediately after that. So stay tuned to Truth to Power. Welcome back to Truth to Power. I'm in discussion with former SARS executive Johan van Lochrenberg. Johan, so what I want to know in terms of the discussions that we'll have with the then Scorpions and, of course, the National Intelligence Agency. Of course, the Minister of Intelligence at the time, Mr. Ronnie Kasrils, were they, as the 2 units, doing any of the work that would have, of course, taken down illicit crime? Or was it just completely down to the unit needing to take that initiative and, of course, taking down what was happening, of course, with these certain criminal organizations? Because when you look at the Sunday Times article that, of course, you did mention, they specifically said a lot of surveillance was used that could have been used by the NIA and the Scorpions. So just give us an idea of why the unit that was, of course, or the number of units that were within SARS needed to use that initiative to, of course, take down the illicit crime that was happening in South Africa.
Well, this South African Revenue Service has a mandate to combat and enforce the laws that are attached to the South African Revenue Service Act in Schedule 1. of which there are, I think, over 30 different laws. And many of them provide, quite significant investigative powers. And there had always been a realization, I think, since the Revenue Service came about in 1996, that we're a developmental state and our criminal justice system is not at the optimal level that it ought to be, such as in a developmental state. One of the key priorities in government all those years was that all government agencies should contribute towards ensuring the safety and security of the nation. And within the legislation of the Revenue Service, it was expected of the Revenue Service to hold tax evaders and customs fraudsters and excise fraudsters to account. Nobody else could. I mean, this is something that had been before courts for years.
Yes.
So in that sense, this unit, was actually quite benign. I mean, the criminal investigations unit was far bigger and had lots more cases. There were a host of other units. And in this particular case, it's not as if they did something special or unique. The only difference between this unit and other units that were conducting investigations really, in essence, boiled down to the fact that they conducted the types of cases where people's lives were at risk or where the evidence was at risk. I mean, people had planned to bomb our offices. People had been stealing things out of our offices. As I mentioned before, our people were shot at, people were killed, people were assaulted, and so on. And so that's really the difference between this unit and other units in that sense. In fact, their powers were even more limited than many of the other units, to the extent that they never raised tax assessments or customs schedules. When they conducted busts and inspections, they always did it together with other units who would conclude those, or with the police or with the Scorpions at the time, and later on with the Hawks and so on. I should also add that by 2009, when all of those people's lives were put in danger by one reckless colleague, many of them were moved to other units. And since late 2009 until 2014, the unit consisted of 7 people only. And they really did a very, very small portion of the work in the bigger enforcement component within the Revenue Service. When it comes to surveillance, the type of surveillance that they did do, for instance, if I can give you a practical example, yes, would be where they received information of somebody who was intent upon robbing one of our state warehouses that was under the South African Revenue Service control. Well, in that case, they would contact the police, and they would, together with the police, sit and wait for the criminals to see if they were going to come and break into the state warehouse. And in some cases, that happened. In other cases, they were asked to go and verify addresses. So they would climb into their cars and they would drive to a particular GPS location and the street address, and they would go knock on the door and introduce themselves and ask if this is the house of Mr. So-and-so. Or they would, in some cases, drive past particular public venues and take down registration numbers so that we could see who the criminal syndicates were meeting with. In some cases, they had to verify public meetings between people. So that's if you and I have met at the local cafe on the street corner, I would say to them, look, I'm going to meet you, and then I give you permission. And so come there at 11 and you'll see us sitting there plotting how to defraud the taxman. So that's the kind of surveillance they did. They didn't use specialized equipment. They didn't use video cameras. They didn't use bugging equipment or anything that had been ascribed to them.
So is that the stuff you would see in movies, Johan?
Yeah, I mean, there's this exotic list of equipment that everybody talks about. I've never seen that stuff, and I can assure you, nor has that unit. I listened to one conversation where the coordinator of the unit was explaining to Mr. Moyane in 2015, when Mr. Moyane wanted to know from them what equipment they had. He was saying, Johan was tough. He gave us nothing. We wanted two-way radios, and we clubbed together and bought two handheld radios from Macro for 1,200 rand. That was probably the most sophisticated equipment that they had in their possession.
Johan, okay, so from what you are saying is that whatever was done in order to, of course, take down illicit crime. But then, of course, three reports come out, one from the Public Protector, the Sikakane report, and, of course, the IGI report. They, of course, all three, and the reason I'm picking out these three is because they vehemently state that, of course, the rogue unit was a criminal organization. And again, I'm using this as an inverted commas, because from the understanding that we're getting, that when this unit was established, it was based on spying on a lot of politicians. So is that something that, of course, was not developed at the time? Was that not the mandate of the time? Or as you say, the mandate of the time was clearly to just go ahead and take out illicit criminals. So why was it that these three reports were stating that the rogue or the unit at the time was being used as a criminal organization?
Well, none of the reports say that it was a criminal organization at all.
No, but when I'm saying not criminal organization, I mean that it was used to spy on politicians.
Well, none of them say that either. The one report that alludes to the possibility is the now reviewed and set aside Inspector General of Intelligence report of 2014. So let's quickly reflect. I mean, I could keep you busy for hours and hours and
unfortunately,
probably days
we
on
only have
these
50 minutes, yes.
But let me try and be as brief as possible. The Sikakane report concluded that the manner in which the unit was established was unlawful.
Okay.
That's the sum total of the Sikakane report's conclusion in respect of the unit. The report does not say why. It also does not say much about the unit. Incidentally, what the Sikakane report does say is that they accept that the unit had never progressed beyond desktop research and the type of investigations that I described to you now. They further say unemphatically that there was no evidence that this unit had any equipment of any kind. So, I mean, that's Sikakane. That report's not worth the paper it's written on. It's some internal legal opinion, according to Advocate Sikakane. That was a list of what things that people were saying, and these things still had to be checked, apparently. So I want people to be very clear. In fact, paragraph 57 of the Sikakane report is very adamant. It was not mandated to even look at the unit. It only started looking at the unit following the SARS-Bug Zuma article on 12 October 2014, and then it took it upon itself. The Sikakane report also then in the same paragraph says by then they had already interviewed me. So if only the panel had thought to call me up, I would have gone at midnight if they wanted me to. I may have helped them to come to a different finding if they bothered. The Kruan report is in fact not a report, it's just a media statement. And as the Judge Kruan testified on oath, and as he conceded before the Judicial Service Council in my complaint in 2019, they merely endorsed the Sikakane report on face value. They didn't investigate, they didn't inquire, they didn't speak to anybody, and they heard nobody. That report is gone. That brings us to the KPMG report.
Yes.
Well, I don't need to say much about the KPMG report. I'm on record to say it's a sophisticated fraud. It's a lie. You can pick the page. I'll show you the lie.
Yes.
It's also been withdrawn. The money's been paid back to the taxpayer, thankfully. I hope they paid interest on that too. That leaves us with the Inspector General of Intelligence report, which I reviewed and set aside, and there was no contest from the other side. So there are, in fact, no reports other than the Public Protector's report, which is currently before our courts for consideration, which relies on all these other reports. Now, there's a confirmation bias, which I think few people actually see. You see, the same people who were the behind-the-scenes so-called witnesses for Sikhakhane correspond with the same people who were the so-called witnesses for KPMG and for the Inspector General of Intelligence and the Public Protector. And the Public Protector seeks to rely on these other reports that mean absolutely nothing. So it's a complete confirmation bias. It's like an onion. It's one layer upon layer upon layer, but when you cut through it, there's nothing in the middle. That's it in a nutshell, really. I mean, I still maintain the fundamental question that nobody's ever asked is, if this unit existed for 7 years, from March 2007 to October 2014, and as I have offered on many occasions, even before court, on oath, that it conducted 81 investigations, I have yet to read in any newspaper what the unit actually did in those 81 investigations. I've read 53 types of allegations, particularly by the Sunday Times rogue journalists, none of which have been proven by Sikhakhane, the Public Protector, KPMG, Inspector General of Intelligence, or anybody else. In fact, they can't even prove their own claims. None of those 53 claims are true at all. They are the most bizarre claims ever. Recently, I on social media, I asked one of the authors to back up the claim that the Revenue Service broke into the home of Mr. Zuma's Forest Town home and bugged Zuma. And what they produced was this incredibly vague so-called memorandum by a very discredited individual with absolutely no detail. What he did not say was that 4 days later, on the 16th of October 2014, following the very first article of 12 October 2014, the members of the unit, as at that point in time, all went in on writing to Commissioner Tom Moyane and set out in absolute detail what they did not do. And they actually requested to be polygraphed, they requested to be investigated, but they also requested an opportunity to defend themselves. That letter was never responded to, and it also never leaked.
Mr. Johan van Lochrenberg, we'll be back after this break to wrap up the final section of the conversation with the former SARS executive. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Truth to Power. I'm in conversation with Johan van Lochrenberg. He is a former SARS executive. Johan, I want to now come to, of course, the Public Protector's report and the EFF that, of course, helped, well, I won't say endorse, but, of course, had been part of one of the defendants in this case. So, Johan, I want to bring in Mr. Julius Malema to the situation because, of course, it's well documented that both you and him had met at the Sheraton Hotel in 2010. Now, of course, it was with regards to the discussion with Project Snowman, but of course, the other part of the discussion was to help him with his tax problems. So that's one part of the conversation, but the other one is, of course, EFF, Public Protector versus yourself, Mr. Praveen Gordhan, Mr. Ivan Pillay. Do you feel that there is a sort of a political agenda to be driven against you through the EFF and, of course, the Public Protector?
Oh, there's no doubt in my mind. I should just clarify something. Yes. My very first meeting ever with Mr. Malema, at the time when he was the president of the African National Congress Youth League, yes, at the Sheraton Hotel, did not relate to his tax affairs at all. The sole purpose of that meeting was to brief him on the fictitious nature of this Snowman dossier that he had been bandying about in the media. And I took him through the line-by-line refutation while he was having lunch. I found him to be attentive. He listened. The meeting was recorded by me officially because I met him alone. And he took a copy of the line-by-line refutation from me and gave me a firm undertaking that he would go and brief the old man with reference to then President Jacob Zuma. And he accepted my bona fides and he accepted my explanation. The meeting that you're referring to, where there were certain discussions relating to his tax matters, only occurred at a later stage at a completely different location, which I won't go into detail, but that too was well recorded and recorded. And then subsequent to that, there were a number of interactions, and I continued to interact with his attorney even after I had resigned from the Revenue Service at their request, as late as 2017. And all of those interactions I also recorded. So, simply put, there is no doubt in my mind that, there's something nefarious at play. Part of the reason has to do with the fact that the public protector claims in her subpoena that was attached in the matter that's currently before court, that she went to a certain address and could not find me there, and said that I had moved away from there, and somebody had spoken to the people at the residence and so on. First of all, there is no such address as reflected on the subpoena, so I don't know who was spoken to. But assuming, all the spelling errors and the wrong numbers and so on, there was just no such discussion at any home that I had lived with, and I went and made a point. So the public protector never ever spoke to me, and I'm probably the person that's best able to clarify facts around that unit. This was acknowledged by counsel of the EFF in an interlocutory matter in relation to the public protector's report, when the Inspector General of Intelligence report was presented by them as evidence and introduced into the court record. I filed an affidavit in great detail, over 700 pages, where I set out the manner in which the unit was created, the manner in which it functioned. I listed the 81 investigations, very clearly demonstrated and reminded him of a few things. And the interesting thing is neither the public protector nor the EFF contested a single word of my affidavit, which means in South African law, that which I said before court is now common cause between them and all parties, and it stands.
Johan,
and yet they continue with this, they continue. I mean, I should say to you, I take great offense to this label, rogue unit. We're talking about 20 plus civil servants, many of them still in civil service. And I want to know if you call somebody a part of a rogue unit, why is that person rogue? I gave the example on radio recently that if you've got a group of police officers who are conducting a roadblock in a particular road, and one of those officers takes a bribe, as an example, that surely cannot render all the people at the roadblock rogue. So I keep on asking, and nobody seems to want to be able to answer me specifically. Why exactly do you brand 20 plus people as rogue? Or why do you brand that unit as rogue? What did they do that was so rogue? We know they didn't break into homes. We know they didn't have this equipment. We know they didn't tap phones. We know they didn't do anything illegal. So why do you brand 20 plus people as rogue, or why do you brand that unit as rogue? Surely you should reflect on the 81 investigations in detail and look at the legislation applied in each instance and look at the subjects investigated and the methodology applied and look at the outcomes. And then you can conclude, okay, these guys were up to no good or not. And I maintain in the 81 investigations that they conducted throughout their time, which, by the way, cost on average about 3,000 Rand per month in operational expenditure, they always functioned primarily. First of all, the rule was it must either be income tax, value-added tax, pay-as-you-earn, customs, or excise, or any combination of that. Secondly, it must be a crime. It must be a crime defined in the legislation administered by the Revenue Service. Thirdly, we had golden rules. Certain things you don't do. If in doubt, you do nothing, which they often did. They rather did nothing. If we were in doubt, we would go and ask. And the bulk of their work they did with other law enforcement agencies. In fact, as recent as last year, a long-standing case dating back to one of their first busts in 2007 resulted in a very lengthy jail sentence of a methamphetamine manufacturer. He received a 20-year jail sentence. 3 of the members of that unit were subpoenaed by the National Prosecuting Authority within the first 3 months of the existence of that unit to come and testify in that trial.
Johan, one final question before we wrap up, and I'm going to ask just 2 minutes from your time. Of course, the High Court and Constitutional Court have set aside, of course, the application by the Public Protector and the EFF. I do remember in the media you said that you felt, in inverted commas, vindicated by the decision. Of course, it's still in the court. So in 2 minutes to wrap up, what are you expecting the outcomes, just to, of course, put this to bed and, of course, put yourself, at ease to say, well, there was no unit. And, of course, all of this was a fallacy. All of this was a myth. In 2 minutes, Johan.
Okay. So, the one thing I need to be very clear on, nobody's ever denied the existence of that unit or any other unit.
No, but I'm talking about it being labeled as the rogue unit.
Sure.
Yes.
What's been denied is the nature of the unit. It was never rogue. What do I expect? Well, we have to wait for the court now. It's a matter that the courts are considering. Depending on what the court says, we'll have to wait and see. It's the public protector issue. I haven't seen, I don't know when that judgment is due, probably this year or next year, who knows. And then we'll have to see. It's about time we start bringing our actions now, because, KPMG's gone, IGI's gone, Kruon is gone. The Sikakane opinion is, it's so discredited, it's unbelievable. There's very little left other than the Public Protector's report, and we're going to have to wait and see what the court finds. I can't preempt that. I don't know. I'm not a party to that dispute, and not for my own reason. The Public Protector just didn't see it fit to engage with me.
Johan van Lochrenberg, former SARS executive, we thank you so much for joining us on Truth to Power.
It's been a pleasure. Shukran.
Yeah, Afwan, it's an absolute pleasure having you. Johan van Lochrenberg, a former SARS executive. Of course, he's the author of 3 amazing books. Do go out there and actually enjoy it if you want to get an idea, of course, of the work that SARS did with regards to, taking out the illicit economy. And, of course, if you want to get an idea with regards to the rogue unit, and I must say, of course, when I say rogue unit, I mean it in inverted commas, because there still is no lawful evidence with regards to it. Death and Taxes and Cop Undercover were the other books that were written by Johan van Lochrenberg. Well, that's all we have for you right here on Truth to Power. Do enjoy the rest of your week and your weekend, and I will see you again, same time, same place, next weekend. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.